Well, thank you, and thank you for staying behind after David's talk. I was expecting the room to empty, actually. This is a complete change of tack. This is very visual. I should warn you, this is not about my buildings, but being an architect, when I want to illustrate a nice building, I will use some of mine. And I will tell you, just in case you think it's the other one. I'm doing a number of the subjects have already been dealt with, so somewhat peripherally, but I'll get past the title. I start off with the idea of what is being modern, and this comes to the idea of modernity as well. My building is the top left one, by the way. You notice that those two buildings at the top are built at the same time, and the famous Ronchon Chapel by Corbusier was built at the same time as Bristol City Hall, actually slightly before. So I'm not going to go into it now, but I have at least 7 definitions of what the word modern actually means. But what's happened is it's been transposed into something stylistic. And various words, we heard earlier about the capture of words, what I call value transfer, is the idea that being modernizing things is good. So you call something which is actually called the international style modernism, and then just call it modern. So you try to borrow the term. And I particularly like this. This is actually a direct quote from I.M. Pei, the architect for the Louvre. He couldn't have been more perceptive about himself. I couldn't have hoped for better. I just happened to extract that quotation. But I want to go back to where all this kind of begins. I think that actually the Saint-Just statement is like the founding statement of modernism. Actually, I mean, in fact, this carries right through to Trotsky and to Pol Pot. Extraordinary. Actually, Saint-Just is also known as the angel of death, which I think is rather appropriate. Basically, if you thought you were being pernicious, you would lose your head anyway. So the idea of innovation, being contemporary, being new, persists. It really comes from this moment, and it persists. And then the idea of modernity, the transient, and it's absolutely necessary. This is what you have to be. Very much a product of late 19th century French thinking, and carries through. And just so we're absolutely sure we know what we're talking about, the idea that the relationship between the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, or the communards particularly. I mean, I understand when the first spacemen went up in space from Russia, they took something about the communards up into space with them. So important was this slaughter of the form of the commune and the slaughter of priests and other officials. So straight on to artistic terms. Of course, it produced this sort of febrile atmosphere after the First World War, produced its own artistic response. And here we have Kandinsky on the top and Chernikov on the bottom right. And this is coming lots of names, and the modernism, international style, and so on. It persists. Now, for a rather curious reason, although this was originally very much a socially reforming left-wing movement, which transferred itself particularly to Germany, as a lot of the Germans were either exiled or decided to leave because of the modernists, because it really wasn't much of a market for their work, and they went to the United States. And the interesting thing is how this style, which is meant to be revolutionary and socially reforming, then became transferred to something commercial. And particularly after the Second World War, the United States specifically wanted to present itself as a modern nation. They commissioned embassies from specific architects to show as a bulwark against communism, and even Conrad Hilton said he was building his hotels so because if people went in and experienced the American way of life, they wouldn't become communists. Personally, it would turn me into a communist, but there you go. And this carried on. I mean, I have to understand some of the rhetoric behind this. These are actually both in the United States by Mies van der Rohe. The great sort of disciple of modernism, Le Corbusier said, today sets us in opposition to the past. Marshall Berman, one of the great sort of modernist theorists, said the manifesto of the Communist Party is the first great modernist work of art. And much more recently, actually, Raphael Moneo said, I eagerly await an architectural world without reference to the past. So this idea of modernity persists, and we see it today. This is Hong Kong, where building glass wall buildings is pretty mad in a temperate climate. It's completely insane in a hot climate. And this is by Daniel Liebeskind, which we now see when we're watching the BBC breakfast program. So you'll see this in the background. This is the War Museum of the North. It's by Daniel Liebeskind. These are inheritors of this basic architectural type. Now, it's very easy to be unpleasant about the architects that work on this, but they actually believe they're doing something good, as a contrary, just misguided. However, this particular architectural movement, is the principle is roughly the Marxist principle that they know where history is going, and they're part of history. So if anyone disagrees with them, they're actually contradicting history. They're contradicting the inevitable thing. And in fact, the kind of insults I get from them are along those lines. They say, why are you using a quill pen? Why aren't you riding a horse? Et cetera, et cetera. The rhetoric is quite strong. I mean, I've had to put up with it for a long time. But some research that I've undertaken, by the way, the top buildings are mine, is actually the broad public. In other words, I was saying that there's no really, our problem with talking about ordinary people is it was a bit difficult, because ordinary means it's slightly pejorative, and we don't use the man on the Clapham omnibus anymore. However, just straightforward, decent, people who don't spend their time thinking about architecture and art, they don't really like those buildings. What they want to do is to live in what loosely called traditional buildings. I'll get to tradition a bit more in a minute. The survey here is one that undertook some time ago. You can read it for yourself. You can read it on the screen. But basically, it confirms this. You can read it both ways. The good thing of the accurate survey, this is a properly done survey, is you ask the same question the opposite way around to compare them. And it comes up with roughly the same result. It's quite difficult to deny this, when you get this information. But however, what my architect colleagues say, I know that's true for housing, but it's not true for commercial buildings. Well, anyone who does any kind of social analysis knows that's extremely unlikely. So we commissioned this survey. This is done by YouGov. And if you read the text, I didn't write that text. That was what we were advised would be a good one. And we have 4 buildings where these commercial, it could be commercial, they could be city halls, it doesn't really matter. Very carefully controlled, same number of people, photoshopped in, same exact position relative back, remove all the variables. The number 1 and number 4 were buildings that have been given serious awards by architects. Number 3 I designed, and number 2 a friend of mine designed in Germany. When the results came out, it went something like this. Really, it's very difficult to deny this kind of information. However, deny they do. When this information came out, I reckoned we would get various responses. And one is you can prove anything with statistics. Second is you fix the answer because that's what you wanted. The third is you ought to educate the public. And the fourth is I don't care. Actually, one journalist who should remain nameless managed to incorporate that all in a 300-word article. I congratulated him afterwards. Unfortunately, this is a matter of passion and belief. It's not a matter of logic. However, these things that one would loosely call traditional buildings, they're buildings. That's what I'm going to try and deal with now. Because I think the concept of what a tradition is a very important concept we live with all the time. And this is the Countryside March, where I met lots of people I knew, and a particularly good, obviously, the photograph the newspapers always like to choose at least 2 attractive girls to put in, and conveniently they were showing this poster. However, actually, the Countryside March is a very good example of something that people considered was traditional. And most of the people, the number of people who actually hunt, it's very few, but I can guarantee that most of the people in there, and probably not even sat on a horse, let alone hunted, but they actually felt that something was being taken away, which was part of their identity. And it's this issue, this relationship between tradition and identity, which I think is very important. And traditions pervade our lives, I mean, in very obvious ways. I mean, we have academics here who no doubt dress up in this kit from time to time. Not so many probably who dress up in the kit on the bottom right from time to time. However, science itself actually, on the basis of building, the way it builds on past knowledge, operates on a basic, broadly traditional basis. Traditions pervade our lives in a whole series of ways. The mere fact I'm talking to you in English, in an English accent, is actually part of, it's all the characteristics of tradition, and it's part of my identity, the way you identify me, even the clothes I'm wearing. It pervades everything we do. Quite a lot of interesting work done on this, which I shall briefly talk about. Two theorists called Boyd and Richardson actually use culture as tradition and culture, which I'll get to in a moment, as being what they call dual inheritance theory. They think it's analogous to genetic inheritance, just very much slower, and it's called cultural transmission. And the principle is that rather like our genetics, is that our ability to transmit information in this particular way is one of the reasons that the human race has been so successful, is that we've been able to transmit information, learn from the past, and pass that on in a particular way. I looked into this a little further. These are interesting sort of tests, if you like. There is a debate at the moment. The conclusion doesn't really matter, and it's a bit difficult because chimpanzees live for a long time. Is do primates, do chimpanzees and bonobos have culture? This is not reading Salman Rushdie or going to the opera. This is culture as something to do with the community. Now, the answer is possibly not, but it doesn't really matter, because the purpose of this is the way that the primatologists define culture is by the transmission of traditions according to troops or groups of chimpanzees that is unique to that group, and it's passed on through the group, not just parent to child, which is or that kind of learning. They may do, they may not, but the important thing about that was that when actually faced with information where you can't talk to anybody, you can't actually, the conclusion they reached was that their definition of what it was culture was tradition. I mean, technically, I think it's culture, not it's custom, not tradition. I mean, that's a fine point, which I won't go into now. You could say that customs are things you just do. Traditions are customs deliberately preserved. But broadly speaking, the idea that this is what constituted culture. Equal with prehistoric archaeology, where there's no written evidence, how do you identify a particular cultural group? You do it by the persistent use of certain things that are above function. If function was the only way to do it, you couldn't possibly do it. So beaker folk are defined by a distinctive design that is passed down from place to place. So these are kind of sort of side issues, but they help us to understand that tradition is something fundamental to culture and fundamental to the identity or the way that groups operate. I mean, the whole issue of archaeology is more complex because we've now got genetics and so on to play with. But nonetheless, the point is the means of researching this and the conclusions are being reached by different disciplines is able to inform this one. And of course, the other thing that traditions do is engage in deliberate display. Deliberate displays is how communities very often identify themselves. As I say, clothing is the obvious one. A whole series of ways that people do it, and actually these have an historic resonance, and you know they take various forms. The army is a very interesting one, actually. Army regiments actually transmit this, very carefully preserved traditions in order to make strangers die for one another. And quite deliberate. It makes the merging of regiments very difficult. It is a commonly acknowledged thing that in war there's often more antipathy to friendly regiments than to the enemy. So one gets a very clear picture, in a way, of how significant traditions are and how they involve aspects of display. And the other thing is that very often the major aspects of this display is at critical moments in our lives. Funerals, christenings, weddings, and so on, where a very specific series of things are undertaken. And it's interesting thing actually, in immigrant communities, language survives less than some of these ceremonies. You go to Australia, for example, you'll find the Greek weddings, Italian weddings, they stop speaking Greek and Italian. So it's in a way, because these are important, this demonstrates the power of tradition. Going on to the power of tradition a bit further, these four gentlemen who are about to wreak havoc in Paris in a football match, they're, as is quite well acknowledged, the tartan system is largely a 19th century invention. I say largely because largely is important. These two gentlemen on the right, looking rather pleased with themselves, are of extraordinary relevance today, are judges of the European Court of Human Rights. Why are they wearing 17th century clerical wear? This only came into existence in 1959. So these are concocted, but I think there's an important thing about this. And at the bottom, actually, is the Tolpuddle Martyrs Festival, which only started in 1930, in spite of the fact it was more than 100 years since the actual Tolpuddle. We were not called martyrs until much later. It effectively established a new trade union tradition. On the right is the Chupinazo, the festival of San Fermin, which goes back to the 14th century, but the Chupinazo in Pamplona was introduced in 1941. The point about this is that Marxist historians like Hobsbawm or Trevor-Roper wrote about traditions as if they were a means of subduing, or elites subduing just poor, unfortunate working people, as we now call them. And I think actually that they got that completely wrong. The fact that you can invent traditions and they still be powerful. I mean, those four Scots lads probably don't know that the tartan was invented, but I don't think it would stop them using it, because they've already established it's part of their identity. And equally well, the European Court of Human Rights, I mean, those robes are a traditional way of establishing your authority. Going back a very long way, and most countries do this. They don't all wear wigs. And then the other thing is, of course, you can add tradition. They can modify. Traditions are not static. In order to test this point, I had to find a negative. I had to find one that didn't work. And this is the White House Guards uniform, only ever used once by President Nixon, whose foreign policy was rather more successful than his home policy. And he encountered so many people wearing shakos and busbies and cuirasses and so on, that he thought that the White House Guard ought to look a bit smarter, and employed a clothing designer to come up with this. Everyone laughed so much, they kind of removed it, and I think it was all sold to the 2nd Ohio Marching Band. But the point was, it had no historical resonance. If you think about the robes or the kilt, they did actually have some historical resonance. In other words, you may have made a bit of it up, you may have modified it, you may have added to it, but it has some sort of historical resonance. And these things are very important to us. Here we have the woolsack, which goes back to Edward III, or black rod down to 1642. Now, these are ceremonies, but they're ceremonies which are important to us because they remind us of our history in very, very specific ways. And these are traditions and traditions give our parliamentary system its identity, as traditions give everyone their identity to some extent. And all this is really part of the process of memory. The Arc de Triomphe, actually it was triumph for various things. It went from 1810 to 1836. And the siege of Leningrad, look at the people at the bottom, by the way, if you can just about see them. This is the motherland calls. And I think it's Rodina met, my version of Zoyot. However, here we have a modernist one, which is by Peter Eisenman, which is a Holocaust memorial. It's quite a fashion for Holocaust memorials. I mean, that actually doesn't really mean anything. And actually, Peter Eisenman basically says it doesn't really mean anything. It can mean anything you want it to mean, which is all rather dodgy, because you end up with something like the Gherkin in London, which was a nickname. It was originally erotic Gherkin. But Norman Foster doesn't call it that. So you're at peril, actually, if you make it too abstract, because somebody can make something up which you don't really like. Or actually, Frank Gehry in Australia had a building which everyone nicknamed a big brown paper bag. It's not what he wanted it to be called. But the memory, using buildings as a form of memory and identity, we're very clear. We do this all the time. Even now. Actually, now is quite a fashion for memorials. And the same, we have the same issue with cities. Our cities, our places, cities, towns, doesn't matter, cities are easy to illustrate, are places which you identify as Charleston on the left, London, this is my building, by the way, just in case you missed it, on the top right, and Valencia and Bruges. I mean, these have very specific identities the people who are there clearly identify with, and it's very much a part of their culture. This is why people get terribly upset by unfortunate new buildings. And the architects say, what if I'm doing something wonderful and new and radical and so on? Yes, but you're screwing up the place with which we identify. Therefore, you're screwing up our identity. And if there's any doubt about this, the deliberate destruction of cities in order to destroy identity is very clear. From Carthage to Hampi on the top right, it was utterly destroyed deliberately in 1565 on the top right. And Mostar, of course, the destruction of that bridge was a deep symbolism at the time. And this is Palmyra. I think there's a whole essay yet to be written on this ISIS destruction, or for that matter, the destruction of the Twin Towers. This is a bit more like the IRA destroying culturally significant monuments at parts of London in the 19th century. Rather slightly different. They're, if you like, they're piggybacking on the importance of the building in order to say that it's slightly different from deliberate destroying of culture, but probably worth including. So an equal is, again, this is my opportunity to put my own buildings up. Bottom is Somerset, top is Bath. No great surprise there. So actually, when you're actually designing buildings in places which have an identity, they don't have to be exactly the same, but they have to have some clear identity with the place that they are. And that's loosely what traditional architecture is. It doesn't have to be classical, it could be anything. And the same applies with cities in a very strong, I mean, here we have New Orleans, and here Siena at the beginning of the Palio. Lots of fancy dress, but actually it's significant because the different districts of Siena, this is extremely important. And in Chicago, their identity with jazz continues to be important. So cities are also not just places, but they're, if you like, a theatre. And these are obvious theatre, but a theatre in every way for everyday life and how people identify. So I'll finish with what I think are really the three critical issues which underlie, and I'm going to use buildings to illustrate them, three critical issues which underlie traditions generally, but obviously I'm going to apply them to buildings. One is ancestry. They have to have some sort, they have to have I put convincing very carefully, because the issue is it can have a real idea, it can have a genuine inheritance, or it can have one that is convincing. And as the White House Guard demonstrated, it wasn't. Interesting, the White House Guard, they could have used the passing out uniforms at West Point, which are genuine historic uniforms. So actually, if they'd done that, it would probably have been all right. So the building on the right is mine. Just double check there. So they have to have a convincing ancestry. And we're quite careful. I've chosen these quite carefully, actually, because that's the Villa Rotunda on the left by Palladio. And Palladio believed he was following ancient Rome. He believed that ancient Roman houses had porticos on them. They didn't. But actually, that's now passed into the tradition of country houses. I mean, anyone who builds a big sort of sod-off house wants a portico on it. And the other one is Fisherman's Bastion in Budapest, in Buda Castle. It was in 1902. This idea, it was something ancient and indigenous. And the building on the right, actually, that is I don't normally do facsimiles, but that is actually a facsimile of a building in that particular part of Bath. So it has to have ancestry. The other thing is actually community identity. I mean, the top one's obvious. We specifically identify communally with this building. It was a new building at the time. But actually, of course, it was designed in a Gothic manner because the Gothic manner was thought to be distinctly British, which is not strictly true either. But never mind, in the 19th century, that was considered to be something that was distinctly British. On the Bottom is actually, this is in Santa Paula in California, built recently by a friend of mine, Duncan Stroik, Thomas Aquinas College Chapel. The point about this building is that this specifically identified the monastic community by reference to European buildings. So there's a very clear reference to specific identity of, if you like, the Catholic Church and this particular community. So very clearly these buildings have an identity for a particular community. The other ones, they have to be identifiable. A quite well-known modernist architect who likely nose put out of joint talking to me about tradition, and he said, well, I do tradition too, but it's invisible. I said, well, it's not tradition then. So very often that's symbolic. I can introduce something that has some kind of specifically. The building on the left is by a former colleague of mine. It's the Oval buildings, the Oval. You probably see it from here, but the column capitals contain a version of the Prince of Wales's three feathers. And at the top, those little urns are very much bigger than the miniatures urn in which the ashes are. But nonetheless, architecture gives you the opportunity to give these signals. And they apply in other cases. We've seen some of the other ones I illustrated, how the army, or a number of people actually, specifically to be identifiable, to be absolutely clear that the point is you can use decoration or symbolism to do that. So those are, in my opinion, the three critical aspects of tradition. And we ignore it at our peril, because eventually, if we lose all our traditions, we lose our identity eventually. And I think this point's been made by others in different contexts. But I mean, if it really is that important, it's going to pervade everything that we do. It's not just something for architecture. It's not just something for politics. It's not just something to do with society. And it's my personal belief that architects always think they're very important. Of course we are. Is that actually architecture is a secondary or tertiary activity after politics, economics, and social change. So it will reflect politics, economics, and social change, which is very worrying when you look at the pervasion of what I call international modernist buildings, produced by architects who just are a self-contained group, basically, but whoever have power and influence amongst bureaucracies. And also, there's a particular thing which I bring up at the end of this, is what I call the tyranny of the modern, or tyranny of the radical. I've sat on a number of committees, where the government committees, where the people there, actually, I know them personally, I know they hate the building they're looking at, but they keep saying, but it's modern, so we've got to let it through. That's a very dangerous position. It's that somehow I'm getting in the way of progress. It's a sort of reverse version of Marxism. Somehow this is the way it's going. I have to get behind this because that's the way it's going. Actually, one thing, Danny Liebeskind, who I showed you earlier, who's a very good presenter, actually was a V&A building. He kept saying, I'm making the future. And the committee said, but he's making the future. I said, no, the future hasn't happened yet. If we refuse it, we make it. But that was a very powerful argument, because people are terrified of being seen to be in some way reactionary, and therefore out of touch, and then standing in the way of progress, another very dangerous word. So I'll finish, is really when it comes to where we live, and these are new buildings, which on a scheme which I designed. I didn't design all these buildings, I wrote the codes for them. In fact, actually, Gary Ryder's colleague actually designed many of these, who used to work with me. So I have sort of a vicarious claim to them. But again, this is in Somerset, which is very clearly identifiable as Somerset, the stone, etc., etc. So just to find off, I wasn't selling my book here, I'm sorry, but you can go out and buy it. I do want somebody to read it. Hopefully that puts a slightly different tack on a number of things you've been talking about, but actually I was very pleased, I hadn't heard the previous talks, is how closely what I've been talking about in terms of tradition, we identify how important these things are, the tyranny of the radical, which is my expression, how they actually fit into that pattern. At least I hope they do. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robert. Hopefully we found the microphone that we lost earlier. Yes, excellent. So So, are there any questions for Robert?
Thanks so much. You showed Bristol City Hall earlier, and I thought that's a very interesting kind of allegory for so much of what's been talked about today. For those of you who don't know, Bristol City Hall, I think about 10 years ago, was completely gutted and turned into a massive kind of open plan interior. There's nothing to indicate on the outside that any modernisation has occurred. So I think, based on what we've been talking about as an architect, when a change is made that people need to know has been made, you've got to signal it on the outside to a degree, haven't you? So how do we make sure that people are reassured that a big change, necessary change has happened, but it's all still okay?
It's a question of how you change it. As I was saying earlier, on the basis of traditions, you can modify them, you can change them, but you have to be very clear precisely where they came from. I mean, this is actually a problem. Clarendon Park, I think, is currently one of the National Trust buildings that burnt out. They said, "Oh, you can't possibly do this again." You know, it's not true. You can, but we've got to show something that's up to date and modern and different, and it's not quite as bad as that in that case. But you know, the danger is that the person that's doing this has lost touch with what was happening on the outside, and you know, you can change. People change buildings all the time. So, I mean, that's what you do. A successful building is the one that can be changed easily. But it's when you actually try and basically the one thing contradicts the other. Now, you're not going to, I don't think, demolish the exterior of Bristol City Hall, a very fine building actually. So if you are doing that, I think you ought to do it not exactly in a manner that would have been done. That's probably not possible, but in a manner that relates to it, so you don't end up with a self-contradiction.
Any further questions? I'm going to ask a question.
Right, nobody else will.
Do you have a favourite building?
No. I'm sorry, it's funny, I haven't asked that actually. I don't really do favourites because, quite honestly, there are so many good buildings. And everywhere I go, I find a new one. I mean, the great privilege of being in the position that you and I are in, actually, and many people here, no doubt, is that when you walk around somewhere, all these architects have left books open for you to read on every street. And it's wonderful. And I'm always finding great new things. I mean, I travel a lot, and I was in Kansas City, actually. I saw a fantastic First World War memorial. Brilliant thing. Never seen it before. I mean, I was in Australia recently. I mean, I'm sorry, the world is full of fantastic buildings, and I really don't do favourites. There's too much that's too good.
Yeah, I agree. It's always great just to walk around the place, and anywhere you go, any big city or town, explore every single part of it, because you just never know what you're going to find. You can really sort of get a sense of the character of the place by exploring, the whole of the town, the whole of the city.
We have another brave questioner in the middle.
This question here, and we'll come back to you.
I don't know if you can start on this. I'm over here.
Sorry.
I don't know if I can start on this, but in recent years there seems to be a mismatch between the exterior of buildings and institutions and the interior. So in the old days, I would look at Parliament, I would look at Buckingham Palace, the law courts with the scales of justice, and that was something that I valued, and these were valuable traditions. And now I look at them and they're beautiful on the outside, but I'm kind of repelled from them. I feel that King Charles would be more at home in his zones, but would be more at home in some brutalist, Stalinist concrete block, because we have the traditional beauty on the outside, but what's on the inside is quite alien and different and brutalist. And
yeah, it's in a way it's a very much say that is that it doesn't have to be like that. I mean, the interesting thing is that well, I mean, even now, but I mean, up until probably 80, 90 years ago, the idea that you would actually give symbolic reference to what's happening was really quite common. It was quite normal. Then suddenly the idea came that actually what really mattered was a kind of uniformity. A developer friend of mine said the way to win an architectural competition is to build a building shape of a shoebox, cover it in glass, and architects will give it an award. I mean, slightly cynical, but broadly true. It's something that came about. It's the idea that houses were, well, the famous saying was machines for living in. But actually, everything in our life is, we enjoy, if you like, symbolic representation. One of the things that's happened quite a lot with museums lately is museums built mostly in the 19th, early 20th century. They often have a portico, and the portico is a signal. It tells you this is the entrance. And anyone goes to it, and they realize that. But a lot of them have decided to put entrances in different places. So you walk up to this thing, which says, "Oh, entrance," in your mind. There's a little arrow saying, "No, it's really down there." And you go down underground or something and find it. Done for practical reasons very often, but what they've actually done is to contradict the language that the building is speaking.
I can do it without the microphone.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, you showed a picture of the House of Parliament, and they alluded to its Gothic style. I'm told that there was a deliberate decision to make it Gothic, to make sure that it wasn't Roman and Republican like France and Washington DC. So I hope that when they come to the point of refurbishing it, they might keep with our good Gothic traditions and our English customs.
Well, I would hope so.
It links to political culture and the buildings that represent political culture. In Berlin, you have the Reichstag with its deformed dome. Should the Germans decide they want to put a dome back on there, as opposed to that rather ugly thing they've got there at the moment, you may disagree with me about that, would that indicate a change of political posture, I wonder?
Just several questions there. One is actually that, yes, when the Houses of Parliament were built, there was a debate as whether it should be classical or should be Gothic. And the decision was to make it Gothic. Ironically, the rhythm of the building and its sort of broad symmetry is actually quite classical. But nonetheless, that was a very specific statement of Britishness. Ironically, the Foreign Office was designed by an architect whose reputation was as a Gothic architect, and he did a Gothic scheme, was told to make it classical, like Giles Gilbert Scott. So he buzzed off to Italy to learn a bit of classicism. But to answer the broader question, I think, on the Reichstag, the story about that is Norman Foster won the competition. It was Norman Foster or Richard Rogers? Richard Rogers, wasn't it, actually? He won the competition showing a space frame over it. But he got the competition, and the Germans said, no, you want a dome back. So I wrote another book called The Globalization of Modern Architecture, big plug. The basic principle of that was that, as I say, that architecture follows politics, economics, and social change. It's difficult to spot it when you're in it, to be perfectly honest, but looking back, it's astonishingly clear. I mean, that reference to what happened in the United States after the Second World War. When I first went to North America in the 70s, I saw some of the best classical buildings I've ever seen. When I came back, sort of Gilded Age stuff, when I came back, nobody believed me. They said, no, it's full of modern buildings, because America had sold itself as, and that the abstract expressionists were supported by the CIA. Because they were expressions of Americans' freedom. This idea of freedom and modernity was something but they just do it. That's just the way it goes. So if a change is made, it will definitely express something political. It has to, because it isn't the architect that's made the decision. It's somebody else that's made the decision, and that'll be somebody in power. So whatever happens, it's going to reflect something. This is the problem I have with stuff that I do. People say, oh, well, it's not of our time. I said, I'm sorry, I woke up this morning and I was in the 21st century, There wasn't a huge amount I could do about that. So everything I'm doing is a 21st century thing. So that idea somehow that they're separate is nonsense. They simply always are. So contemplate what some of these brutalist and abstract buildings tell us about our political culture.
One more question.
It's a slightly previous one. Is it true that some sort of famous modern British architect went over to America one day and saw their sort of box-like warehouse buildings with a lot of think they must have had a lot of glass, and then came back and won a prize for designing something that was rather like that, and then that kind of box-like cubical glass and and then they started to proliferate. Is that what I got that vague?
I would say vaguely, good enough. I mean, the early modernists, people like Le Corbusier, writing in the 1920s, they also saw America as a model of efficiency. And it was, you're right, it was grain silos and these kinds of things that these German architects particularly, Czech architects particularly liked, and French architects as well. They liked these, and they said these are very good. They then developed their own particular architecture, which was kind of inspired by this. It's an interesting, complex story. They were then kicked out by, well, not kicked out, but Hitler didn't give them the work. So they went to the United States. The United States took this on, very supported by certain people. Then after the Second World War, it was brought back again in its commercial, as a contrary to socially transforming type, to Europe. And so it's a bizarre thing. It kind of went one way, back way. You know, that's the way it goes. So yeah, broadly speaking.
Okay, thank you very much for
Our mission at the New Culture Forum is and always has been to defend and celebrate Britain's history, culture, and its people, and indeed Western civilization, at a time when both are under sustained attack. We have grown from small beginnings to become the country's most influential right-leaning cultural think tank. Our content is watched and read by some of Britain's most influential political figures. But now, we need your help. If you believe in what we do, then please do become a member. For as little as £4 a month, you can make a vital contribution to what we do. As a member of the NCF family, you will help ensure that we can continue to produce quality content online, such as our 3 weekly programs, Whittle, which is our flagship interview show, Newspeak, our panel discussion show, and Deprogrammed, which is targeted at Britain's youth. As you probably know, in addition, we produce important documentaries, such as our critically acclaimed 6-part series, The West, a stunning celebration of the history and genius of Western civilization, and our ongoing documentary series, Heresies, with hard-hitting episodes tackling subjects such as immigration, gender ideology, and BBC bias. But the New Culture Forum is much more than a YouTube channel. We don't just complain about Britain as it is, we provide real solutions and clear policies on how we can push back against the madness and restore sanity to this nation. Our presenters are now highly sought after and have become familiar faces across the media. Our prestigious annual Smith Lecture and our regional and indeed national conferences have attracted world-class speakers. Perhaps most importantly, we are the only organisation on the right of politics that has launched a national movement without actually being a political party. And uniquely, through our NCF Locals programme, we've established some 30 active branches in towns and cities right across the nation, from Edinburgh to Exeter, and with many more on the way. We're very proud of what we've achieved, and our members have made it possible. In return, our members receive access to exclusive content, invitations to private events, free or discounted tickets to our conferences and lectures, free copies of our books, and much more. I very much hope that you'll join us too by clicking the link in the description or going to our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Now is the time that we need your help. Thank you.